Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And thank you for joining us in person here at the Atlantic Council headquarters and virtually around the world. I'm delighted to welcome Scott Nathan, Chief Executive Officer of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, to the Atlantic Council for this latest edition of Atlantic Council Front Page, our premier platform for global leaders. In 2018, the U.S. Congress passed the BUILD Act to boost U.S. economic engagement in emerging economies, reinforce national security, and advance foreign policy goals. 5 years later, and now under Scott's impressive leadership, the DFC has leveraged its financial tools to support private sector investments in areas such as energy security, climate goals, global health, food security, digital infrastructure, agriculture, and more. Yet there's still a great deal of untapped potential in promoting global energy security and other strategic priorities, which Scott will be discussing today. And this comes at a moment when Congress is preparing to vote on reauthorizing the BUILD Act. The conversation you're about to hear with Scott will delve into the DFC's mandate and in particular its tools to attract more private capital into the energy sector. Full disclosure, I'm proud to serve on DFC's Development Advisory Council. I believe deeply in its mission and the crucial role it plays at a moment that Joe Biden has correctly called an inflection point in history. And in that context, Scott's also speaking on a day when President Joe Biden signed into law a supplemental national security package passed by the House over the weekend and by the Senate yesterday. That also fits into the context of this inflection point in history that we confront together. The Council's Africa Center, our Global Energy Center, our Adrian Arch Latin America Center, our Digital Forensic Research Lab, and our Eurasia Center have all, at one time or another, cooperated with DFC to advance finance solutions to address today's most critical challenges, in particular facing emerging markets. So a particular thanks today goes also to Landon Durrance, who so capably leads our Global Energy Center, which brought together this event. Now to Scott Nathan. Scott brings to DFC rich experience across public and private sectors. He served as a senior advisor in the White House after having worked on the Biden-Harris presidential transition appointments team before coming to DFC. He previously served during the Obama-Biden administration at the Office of Management and Budget, and prior to that, he worked in the State Department, focusing on protecting U.S. economic interests abroad and advocating on behalf of U.S. exports. Before his public service, Scott was for nearly 2 decades in leadership positions at the Baupost Group, a private investment partnership in Boston. From that, he has rich experience investing across asset classes and global markets. He began his investment career appropriate to his current job in our conversation today on emerging markets, and particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. Some of the richest conversations I've had with Scott range from discussing his several trips to Ukraine to the groundbreaking deals he's brought home from Africa to Latin America to Sri Lanka. So Scott, we're delighted to have you here with us today, and thank you for taking the time. To moderate today's discussion, I'm delighted to pass to Amelia Lester, Executive Editor at Foreign Policy. So that's a huge job that she does extremely well. But outside of her demanding day job, I read that she has written brilliant features ranging from the history of avocado toast for The New Yorker to the life of then New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern for Vogue. So Amelia, Scott, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for those remarks. And it is a historic day today. I wonder if we could start, Scott, by talking about whether the passage of that supplemental national security package is going to change or affect your work at the DFC at all.
Well, first, Amelia, thanks for moderating, and to the Atlantic Council, and especially to you, Fred. Thank you for the kind remarks, for hosting us here today, and for your commitment to DFC. Your service on the Development Advisory Council has been high impact, and you've been a great partner, and across the whole organization, you've been a great partner for DFC. So, Amelia, yes, it is a historic day. It is a fantastic piece of news that the bill has passed and has been signed into law, and the critical aid that it will supply will be flowing, I think, as we speak. That impacts DFC because part of our mission has been to support the private sector in Ukraine. And really, in order to support the private sector and economic growth and recovery in Ukraine, the most critical component is solid air defense in order for economic activity to move forward. Hard to make decisions around investment and capital expenditure in an environment of such high insecurity and questions. Our tools help with that. We've provided in the last year nearly $500 million of financing into businesses in Ukraine. We also have a political risk insurance tool that helps take that tail risk of war risk damage off the table for investors and lenders. And that tool is in high demand, and we have a really robust pipeline of future deals that will help make a difference to kind of lessen the economic damage of the current horrible situation that Ukraine finds itself in because of Russian aggression, and as a result, hopefully make recovery quicker and easier.
We actually got an audience question along those lines asking how the DFC is aiding Ukraine. That's a good reminder for me to tell everyone that you can submit your questions for Scott at askac.org, and I will turn to them throughout and certainly at the end of the discussion. Let's begin at the very beginning. There's not many things in Washington that both sides of the aisle agree on, but when the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation was founded just 4 years ago, this was one of those things. Tell us about the impetus for creating this agency and why you think it garnered that bipartisan support.
Well, you're exactly right. We did at the beginning, and we still do today, enjoy strong bipartisan support that's been reflected not only in the passage of the BUILD Act, but it's been reflected in the way that we've been funded every year. We've had the support of Congress for a very aggressive growth plan, and I think to answer your question, what that comes from is a strong sense that the United States needed to up our game in economic diplomacy. We needed to show up in the developing world and offer an alternative to what was being offered by authoritarian governments and our strategic competitors, that there was a sense that the United States was just not adequately showing up. And we are part of the effort to do that. The BUILD Act gave us a dual mission, both to make development impact in the poorest countries of the world, but also to explicitly advance the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States. Good development is good foreign policy. It does help promote stability. That's in our national interest. But we can be more forward-leaning on risks than our predecessor agencies, the Development Credit Authority at USAID and OPIC. We have a broader tool set. It includes equity investing and technical assistance grants, in addition to the traditional loans and loan guarantee programs and political risk insurance that I already mentioned. We no longer have to have explicit U.S. content in our projects, which has actually been very important for supporting our partners and allies and accessing a whole different type of deals in the infrastructure and energy, food security, and healthcare space, in addition to the support for small business that we've done traditionally. So I think that's where the bipartisan support comes from. There's a strong demand signal for us to do more, to show up and offer that kind of alternative. I mentioned part of that is continuing to grow our organization. Maybe we'll get to it in this discussion. That requires us being reauthorized. It requires continuous funding at a high and, I hope, increasing level. But we have to show results, and I think we're starting to do that. Did $9.3 billion of transactions last year across a full range of countries and deal types that really demonstrated the strategic impact that we can have.
Well, I do promise that we're going to get to energy security, since that was in the title of this event. But before that, I do want to dig in on perhaps an example of how DFC works, and maybe that will be helpful. A big recent loan, I know, was $533 million to establish a deep water shipping container terminal at the Port of Colombo in Sri Lanka. that's the kind of money that has people comparing the DFC to China's development banks, banks which have struck these big ticket deals around the world. And those banks are often accused of debt trap diplomacy. Sri Lanka itself is debt strapped. So how is what the US is doing with the DFC different from what we see China doing?
The deal you mentioned is one of the premier deals that we did in the last year, and I think it really highlights the contrast and speaks to the answer to your question. We support the private sector. We're not lending money at the sovereign level for projects that are big and also sometimes bloated, maybe not appropriate for local laws and conditions. We take the demand signal from private project developers, from private companies who will have skin in the game because they're providing equity. They're also managing the projects. These projects are commercially viable and for profit. That helps prevent the kind of problem that you're making. Furthermore, it's critical to the United States and frankly to our allies who also have development finance institutions that we maintain the highest standards possible. That's standards for environmental, social, labor practices. That's making sure that we've vetted the counterparties to make sure they're free of corruption, free of money laundering issues. We do know your customer work. This is critical to us, that not only do we find projects that help the economic development in the countries that we care about and where we work, but that we also promote the values inherent in what the United States policy is to be appropriate for local. We're not trying to impose ourselves, we're trying to be appropriate. And the deal you mentioned, Sri Lanka, previously ran into some macroeconomic trouble. We did a large bank deal in that context to provide critical funding for small and medium enterprises. But during that period, they had to restructure some of the debt they had at the sovereign level, and the port of Hanabata in the northern part of Sri Lanka was converted into a 99-year lease to a Chinese entity. There's fears about how that might be used. The port we're developing is in the port of Colombo, critical shipping lane from the Straits of Malacca to the Suez Canal. The Indian subcontinent has shallow ports and relies on transshipment, so high strategic value to our partner in India. So we backed an Indian company that's working with the largest conglomerate in Sri Lanka, also a private company, with a small ownership from the Port Authority of Colombo, to develop this 2 million TEU plus annual TEU container terminal in Colombo. It's ahead of schedule, it's on budget, and it's immediately adjacent to a port operated by China Maritime.
You mentioned that a key distinction with the Chinese development banks is that you're working with the private sector in these countries, and I understand that the company that you're working with on that port, on that terminal, is Adani, which is a giant Indian company, the company seen as very close to the Modi government in India. You touched on the vetting processes, but you're essentially putting a thumb on the scale for certain companies, I guess, in making these partnerships. And how do you think about making that decision and who you go with?
Yeah, so we don't think about it that way, that we're trying to promote those companies. We are the taker of what the market offers up. We're constantly trying to develop our deal pipeline. I'd like to see many times what we currently see in the deal flow. We have the capacity to do it. It's a question of building our team, but we have the financial capacity to do it. So when deals come along, we vet the project counterparties very carefully. We work with our local embassies. We do all the kind of diligence that I already mentioned. And if that happens through a commercially viable project like what you're referring to, if that happens to benefit the counterparties involved, that's a good thing, because we are looking at commercially viable projects that are for profit. And if the developer isn't going to profit, then the analysis was maybe off.
I think you mentioned to me before that this terminal is right next to a Chinese terminal. Is it the right way to think about what the DFC is doing, that it's in a way counteracting the Belt and Road Initiative and the Global Development Initiative? You're working in some of the same places and some of the same sectors?
Yeah. I mean, some people have characterized it that way. I think we're not directly competing. We're offering an alternative, but because of what I was saying about the private sector versus the public sector and the sovereign level, there aren't that many instances where it's head-to-head competition. We're very concerned that procurement processes that we get involved in or projects that we're backing get involved in are handled in a legal and above-board way, free of corruption or any kind of bribery. That's critical to us. I think it actually often serves the interests of the countries where we operate, because if we are involved, it's almost like a good housekeeping seal of approval. It's same for many of our allies who have development finance institutions. We insist on very high standards, and sometimes that means we lose out on projects, but often it's to the benefit of the country where we operate and their political environment.
Let's move on to energy.
Yeah.
I know you recently went to India to launch a solar panel manufacturing facility in Tamil Nadu. That's another $500 million loan, this time, I understand, to the Indian government.
No.
No?
To the company First Solar, which is actually an American
Got
company.
it. Okay. Thank you for correcting me on that. Can you talk through how this deal exemplifies what the DFC is trying to achieve in that sector?
It really does. I had a chance to visit the facility for its ribbon cutting in January in Chennai in Tamil Nadu, as you said. And it's such an impressive facility. They put it up in just a year and a half. This will produce 3.3 gigawatts of solar panels per year. It does it with, you're seeing pictures of it's an incredibly impressive factory. And although you don't see a lot of people working in the factory, it does employ 1,100 people, 40% of whom are women. So economic empowerment of women is a very strong economic development objective for us. But this plant also fits into the supply chain diversification goals that we have. For the industries of the future, we need to make sure that we're not dependent on one country or one company for the inputs of the industries of the future. This plant operates on a thin film cadmium telluride technology, 100% sourced locally in India, no connection to China or other countries. And it's supplying the demand that's in India. India has a goal by 2030 to have 50% of its energy come from clean sources, and by that time to be completely self-sufficient for solar panels. That's why we have 2 other solar panel manufacturing projects, also in the state of Tamil Nadu, which is a great business environment. We did last year a $425 million loan to TP Solar, part of the Tata Group, for another solar panel manufacturing facility, and we signed a retainer letter with Vikram Solar. If we can do this kind of thing elsewhere in the world to make sure that supply chains are broadly diversified, that helps with resilience, like we saw the necessity of during the pandemic. But even more broadly, we don't want to replace dependency on oil to a couple of nations where there's all sorts of strategic vulnerabilities with strategic vulnerabilities to other nations for the inputs of the energy of the future. That's why we're focused on critical minerals and other inputs. It's why we're focused on the supply chain and manufacturing and deployment of e-mobility solutions. We need to make sure that globally these are diversified, and we support our partners in the development of their own industries. That's really something that we're focused on. Value add in multiple countries is better off for the global economy.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point, that we don't want to replicate the same reliance in green energy. Just a decade ago, China supplied 40% of the world's solar panels. Today, its global market share is over 80%. Obviously, projects like the ones you've mentioned in Tamil Nadu are trying to make strides to change that. But how would you ideally like to see that industry shaped over the next 5 to 10 years? And what's the DFC's role in doing that?
Yeah, I think it's just more of what we're already doing. I think there's opportunities in Africa for solar panel manufacturing. And here, I just want to be clear, I'm not talking about manufacturing for export to the United States. At the moment, the United States does not manufacture enough solar panels and is importing from Asia, and there's questions about the way to handle that and what tariff levels and should be. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about meeting local demand all over the world with locally produced product. So India has a long way to go before their local demand is satisfied by Indian-produced product. We will be way better off if they increase their capacity, and I think that's going to be true particularly in Latin America and Africa as well.
Let's step back a little bit. You used a phrase before, economic diplomacy. How does the DFC's unique position in straddling public and private sectors help it advance this idea of economic diplomacy? And maybe a related question is, how is it different from other government agencies who are also looking to further American foreign policy? And what are the points of overlap?
Well, sure. We work very closely together with our colleagues at the State Department, at USAID, at some of the other smaller agencies like the Trade and Development Agency or EXIM that also finance projects. We're not making grants other than small technical assistance grants to further projects that we're considering financing. We are financing the private sector in commercially viable for-profit situations. So that's a big distinguishing feature for DFC. We're not involved in export finance. That's EXIM. We're working on projects that add economic activity, local development impact in the countries where we work. And that is really in high demand. When I travel, and I travel a lot, I hear and meet here in Washington with foreign government officials. They're looking for an alternative. I mean, and you can understand, they don't want to be dependent on one country for their source of finance. There's often strings attached. There's often problems from a quality point of view associated with that. In most cases, they don't want to denounce or renounce that, but they're looking to diversify and have alternatives. And that's created a huge opening. I have, for example, met multiple times with President Lourenço of Angola. I went to his inauguration for his second term, and he very explicitly in his speech talked about diversification of economic partnerships. And now we have a deal to finance a very large railway in northern Angola. We have a deal for water systems in central Angola. We've been working on cell phone investments there. So we have a big pipeline of potential deals, and it's just a microcosm of what we're seeing all over the world.
It is a big pipeline, and I want to ask you how the DFC prioritizes its projects. But before that, I wanted to remind everyone that you should be submitting questions to us. We'd love to hear from you at askac.org. Back to the pipeline. Let me quote from the BUILD Act here. It says it gives priority to less developed countries with a low-income economy or a lower middle-income economy. Right. That obviously still leaves a ton of countries. I'm curious how you think about this as an opportunity, but also the flip side of risk in all of this.
Yeah, so our portfolio is about $42–43 billion right now in 113 countries. So you're right, there's a lot of room to work in. And I should add, there's a separate piece of legislation governing us called the European Energy Security and Diversification Act, which authorizes us very importantly and super timely for what happened in February 24th, 2022 with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That piece of legislation authorizes us to work in Central Europe on energy security. So even though the majority of countries in Central Europe are high income, in the 3Cs initiative, basically all but one country is high income, we can still work in those countries explicitly on energy security, energy infrastructure, and we have. We've done quite a few projects. We can get into that. This is a very large playing field for us around the world. We're driven by the market signal where there are projects.
The agency has been criticized for a risk-averse culture by CSIS and others. I guess this is because, in part, it has to return money to Treasury each year. Does that mean that you aren't able to do some things that you might like to do because they're too risky?
You know, it's a great question. Part of the idea of creating the BUILD Act was, and creating DFC through the BUILD Act, was to be able to be more forward-leaning on risk. And I think we've really changed the culture from OPIC. One of the features of OPIC was that it was financially self-sustaining. We're appropriation financed now. To be financially self-sustaining, there was a natural move toward less risky deals in upper middle income countries in order to have that kind of return of capital to fund the working capital needs of the agency. That's no longer the case. We're 100% appropriation funded. That has really freed us up. We also have some tools that are more forward-leaning on risk. Our ability to make equity investments, and here this is something we'd like to fix in reauthorization or sooner. It's an objective of the administration to make that tool meet the original promise that the authors of the BUILD Act intended. I won't go into the boring details, but there's some budgetary accounting issues that have limited us to only about $500 million of equity investment a year. If we were able to have that tool unleashed, we'd be able to be much more forward-leaning on risk. But we are not trying to solve the United States deficit through our investments. We're not looking to generate a huge return, to pay a huge dividend to Treasury. I'm happy if on a portfolio basis we make money. That means our analysis of the commercial viability of our projects was correct. But if you look at the projects we've done in the last 3 years, last 2 years, we are being much more forward-leaning on risk, and that meets the demand that Congress has given us.
And I imagine you have to balance that against the national security and foreign policy goals you have too.
100%. I mean, we only do projects that fit within our foreign policy and national security objectives. That takes a certain group of countries off the table. That means projects where we can't vet the partners fall off if they don't meet our standards, if there's not people we want to do business with. That's often disappointing, but that's what we have to do. I mean, we don't have deal heat to the point where we'll undermine our standards ever.
Speaking of national security, I want to get to a key issue here, which is connectivity and the infrastructure that provides it in this obviously increasingly digital world. How does the U.S. need to invest around the world in connectivity? I want to draw on an audience question here. Given that many, if not most, of the world's new internet users will take their first online steps on Chinese-made fiber, on Chinese hardware, operated by Chinese-backed companies, what steps will or could DFC take to support efforts to expand last-mile connectivity that are more in line with American values?
It's a great question, and this is a big push for the administration, and actually the previous administration too, to make sure that as networks are upgraded, new networks are created, that they're using safe and secure equipment that reflects the values that we have, the privacy, protects the privacy of users. And that cannot be said to be true right now globally. This is a push for us. I can give some examples of where we've started to make a difference, but we have a long way to go. We supported the Australian company Telstra in its acquisition of a company called Digicel, their assets in Papua New Guinea and 5 other Pacific Island nations. This is critical for Australia because that's right in their neighborhood, and the fiber backbones and the cellular telephone networks there were in need of upgrading. By Australia supporting Telstra to do this acquisition, we supported Australia along with our partners in Japan at their development finance institution, JBIC. We provided financing. This has put that whole network into a different position for upgrade and what kind of equipment they would choose. In Africa, we've made a $300 million loan to a company called Africa Data Centers, which is building out landing stations and landing stations from subsea cables, and then data centers. We've so far done data centers in Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, Morocco, and they have more in the works. This is critical for growth. The kind of infrastructure you need is not just roads and energy, airports and railways. You need the infrastructure of the 21st century for economic development. And in Africa, there's an enormous hunger to be connected to the world and great opportunities for development in places like Ghana and Kenya through digital connectivity. We need to make sure it's on the right kind of equipment. We have a long way to go here. Part of it is just the competitive environment of suppliers. There are very few non-Chinese suppliers, Korean, Scandinavian. We can back them.
I'm going to get to some great audience questions that we're getting on energy security, but before that, I have to ask, since you did mention that connectivity was a priority for the previous administration as well as this one, what can you share with us about the changing priorities between the two administrations for the DFC and where they'd like you to invest?
You know, I think DFC launched in December of 2019. So that was, if you think about the environment then, it was challenging. We had the pandemic just a few months after the launch. We had political transition here. I think what we've done is tried to continue the effort to really build out DFC as a robust entity to fulfill all the kinds of priorities that we've been discussing. We've refocused around some enduring priorities. Our team has now been structured along the lines of infrastructure, energy, food security, healthcare, and support for small business. And we have an overlay throughout that of economic empowerment of women. That was a thrust under the previous administration as well. And addressing the climate crisis, which really weaves through all of those areas. So I don't see it as some major change. There's always going to be, from one administration to another, difference of emphasis. But the key is making sure that DFC has the human resources and the financial firepower necessary to fulfill its mandate under the Build Act.
Let's draw on an audience question that I was also curious about and meant to follow up with you on. You drew an important distinction between the fact that when you're helping to build solar factories in India, that's not with the hope to export that solar capacity to the U.S. So how do DFC's investments in the Global South promote energy security here at home?
So I should say one thing, that's in our statute as a requirement to measure impacts on U.S. jobs. And so we have a team of economists that does that analysis, and we avoid U.S. impacts in that way. So important to say that. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
It was asking you to tease out the connection between building these kinds of solar factories in India and how that promotes energy security here in the U.S.
I see. Well, it's part of the diversification of global supply chain. I think having countries be able to be self-reliant, to have the energy they need for economic development, that promotes stability, that promotes economic development, and that's good for our security. So I don't know that it promotes energy security in the United States, it promotes our national security.
Mm-hmm. Right. You mentioned, this is another audience question related to energy, you mentioned critical minerals as part of the, speaking of clean energy supply chains. How is DFC investing in critical minerals?
It's a great question, and this is a huge priority for us. One of our equity investments is in a company called TechMet. TechMet is a platform that has invested around the world in different projects for a kind of Western-leaning supply chain for critical minerals. The United States owns 15% of this company and has continued to provide financing for each subsequent project. So that includes a recent project in Brazil called Brazilian Nickel, which is also developing cobalt and processing cobalt in a less energy-intensive and environmentally impactful way. This company has also projects in sub-Saharan Africa to do rare earth minerals, amongst others, and we'll continue to work with them. We did last year also a project in Mozambique on graphite. This works closely with a project that the Department of Energy has funded in Vidalia, Louisiana, to process graphite. So one of our goals is that the Mozambique graphite mine that we're supporting ultimately has a U.S. off-taker for processing. It's critical to start with the sourcing of the minerals, but there's a whole value chain that includes processing and ultimately making the inputs into the, whether it's batteries or otherwise, with critical minerals. And we continue to look at a big pipeline. For a development finance institution, mining is a challenge because of all of the standards I mentioned previously. Mm-hmm. So we're very focused on doing it in a high standard way that respects the environment, respects social displacement in local communities, and promotes strong labor standards. So that raises the bar, but there are projects out there, and we're continuing to pursue that.
I did find striking that over the past 3 years, DFC's climate finance commitments have grown from less than $500 million to $3.7 billion.
Yes.
Maybe we can just end the energy part of the discussion with what are you feeling like is going to be big growth areas for you in energy in the coming years?
Well, just to say in that climate-related funding numbers that you quoted, that's everything from the deployment of renewables. For example, in Malawi, we funded a $25 million project to provide on-grid solar and storage. So the first of its type in sub-Saharan Africa to have battery storage coupled with solar to give stability to the grid. We do everything from that to, in those numbers, are some of the large debt for nature swaps that we've done that help keep climate in the, carbon in the ground and promote climate benefits through conservation. Whether that's in Gabon or Ecuador, where we did a huge project in the Galapagos, and we have a strong pipeline of these kind of projects. It also is regenerative agriculture that keeps carbon in the ground. It's forestry projects that we've worked on, as well as all the type of projects that we've already been talking about.
I've got a great question here from Olga Kakova, Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. What have you learned from investing in countries under assault, such as Ukraine, that would be important for other international financial bodies to know as they develop tools or insurance mechanisms to spur private investments in economies at war? Olga writes, no large-scale war risk insurance pool exists today for Ukraine, for example.
It's a great question. First, we are working very closely with our peers in the development finance world on getting support for the private sector in Ukraine. So that's particularly EBRD, the IFC, the EIB. We have worked with all of them, jointly financed projects with other bilateral development finance institutions. We've all invested equity in a company called Horizon Capital that is looking for, both in Ukraine and Moldova, high-tech growth opportunities to keep people employed as a strong relative advantage of the economy in Ukraine, the tech expertise. But I'd say in general, the United States, because of the tradition of political risk insurance, has an advantage. That goes back to the Economic Recovery Act of 1948, the Marshall Plan, when the United States started mobilizing private capital through the use of political risk insurance. In 1971, our predecessor agency, OPIC, started doing that. From the time OPIC started doing it until today, we've done over $50 billion face of political risk insurance, only had just over $1 billion of claims, and we've recovered 97% of those claims. So it's been not only very important for economic activity, mobilizing capital to support economic recovery, but it's been very profitable. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because the United States steps into the shoes of the private party when there's a dispute, whether it's expropriation or other issues, and in this case, war risk damage. We're very focused on that in Ukraine. We're focused on building the domestic insurance industry as well. We have some investments in the pipeline for that, and we're working closely with our partners to do that, because really the only other public entity that provides political risk insurance is MIGA at the World Bank Group. They have a smaller capital base and a little different way of going about it, but we've worked closely. We just did a deal with them for a canned goods manufacturing company called CanPack. We each provided $25 million of political risk insurance for the investor to expand and rebuild that facility. This is going to be crucial for energy projects, for projects to support the export of agricultural products, which is a huge part of the Ukrainian economy. We have a lot of potential deals in the Danube area in that regard. So we're trying to share with our partners because we're going to need everybody, all hands on deck, for helping to rebuild the Ukrainian economy.
Okay, this is the rapid fire round. It consists of one question. How can the DFC enhance its ability to lend in foreign currencies?
Oh, fantastic question. So the BUILD Act authorized us to do that. There's a huge demand signal for local currency for long-term projects. If you think about having revenues in local currency, you want to line up your liabilities against those revenues so you don't have a foreign currency mismatch. We have trouble lending directly in foreign currencies for all kinds of arcane interagency reasons, we have the ability to make loan guarantees to financial institutions, which can then provide local currency lending. We're currently working on making sure that we're able to take full advantage of that authority. That's a inside the U.S. government kind of effort to make that happen. I'm optimistic that we'll get there, but it's really crucial in order to be able to make the kind of impact that we need to make. We also have reauthorization coming up, so that could also be a way for Congress to be more explicit about their view on this subject.
I'm going to get to reauthorization. Before that, as we move to close, maybe a more existential question from Stephen Shapiro, Senior Advisor at the Atlantic Council. He asks, when it comes to projects that are considered in support of U.S. national security, how are those determined?
Great question. So, first, we look at the security strategy that we have for each individual country. We work closely with our ambassadors in those countries and their whole teams to make sure that the projects that we're considering within a country are in line with foreign policy. We have our own foreign policy team, a structure that we've created actually in the last couple of years that does that work in the interagency. And then, of course, we have a board, the chair of whom is the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. Samantha Power, the USAID administrator, is our vice chair. Commerce, the Secretaries of Commerce and Treasury are also on the board, and we have 4 private individuals in addition to myself. So that gets worked into the conversation. But really, it's kind of a seamless process because we work closely with our colleagues at the National Security Council, at the State Department, and all these other agencies to make sure that our projects are in line with our objectives.
Okay, last question. The DFC is up for reauthorization this year. I'm going to wave a magic wand. It happens. I'm also going to grant you lots more tools and resources.
Excellent.
What do you want to do with them? What do you want to do more of in the remaining minute?
Yeah, so you're right. We need to have our total portfolio expanded, have some of our tools fixed. There's some other issues related to making sure we have the staff in place, the ability to spend fees and other things. I think it's all part of the growth and development of this agency to fulfill its mandate to make development impact around the world in a way that serves our national security. I'd like to see us increase materially the number of deals we do in a year, the size of the deals we do in a year. We can't give up the tradition of making small deal impact on development, but we need to really have the staff in place and the proactive business development and strategy development to find those projects out there. So that's more ports, more airports, more energy deals, that kind of infrastructure that's critical. That's an initiative, I should say, of President Biden very explicitly and his G7 colleagues. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is all about mobilizing capital to the private sector to meet the infrastructure needs in a high standard way that's appropriate for the developing world, and that's what DFC is all about.
So to sum up, it sounds like the financial capacity is there, assuming reauthorization happens, but you need more tools, more people, so that you can find more projects.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, we'll all be staying tuned. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining us today. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting the discussion. And thank you to our in-person audience and to our virtual audience for joining this AC Front Page event. We look forward to having you join us again.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Great.